Namaskar, good morning from North America, and good evening to all my beloved community members and viewers back home in India. As I welcome you today to the episode 9 of the Homeland podcast, season 1, it's my absolute honor and a great privilege to welcome a very, very special guest today on my show, none other than the great Padmashri Dr. Subhash Kak. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Himalay ji. Delighted to be a part of this wonderful sequence.
Thank you so much, sir. Dr. Subhash Kak needs absolutely no introduction and is a widely known name in India, across the globe, and especially in our own Kashmiri Hindu community. But just for the sake of introduction, let me just quickly put across his brief introduction. Dr. Subhash Kak was born in Srinagar, Kashmir. He is alumnus of NIT Srinagar and IIT Delhi. Dr. Subhash Kak is a great computer scientist, theoretical physicist. He's a historian. He's a linguist. He's a philosopher, a poet, and much more. And it won't be wrong to call Dr. Subhash Kak a polymath. He is a Regents Professor of Computer Science at Oklahoma State University, Stillwater. He is recipient of India's fourth highest civilian award, the Padmashri, and we sincerely as a community wish to see him receiving the Nobel Prize very soon one day. And he is also member of Indian Prime Minister's Science, Technology and Innovation Advisory Council. Dr. Kak has authored a number of books, including the Astronomical Code of the Rig Veda, The Nature of Physical Reality, Mind and Self, The Architecture of Knowledge, Computing in Ancient India, The Secrets of Ishwar, and much more. Dr. Subhash Kak ji is an absolute epitome of knowledge, and when you have him as a guest on your show, so you ask questions and as a seeker and a learner. So on that note, let me just kick off this conversation. Subhash ji, Bumara shu sesan godnuki sawal toy prusun. The very first question I want to ask you is, it is little personal and I probably nostalgic, but we really want to know something about your childhood, early days in Kashmir, and the build up to that 1990 genocide, and then your days in exile, and how you are doing nowadays.
Well, I was born in Sathu Barbar Shah in Srinagar. This is where our Kak clan has lived for a very long time. And my father used to be posted in different small towns in Jammu and Kashmir. My father was a veterinary doctor. And although I was born there, but I grew up, first of all, my very first school, I think, was in Basoli. And after that, the next school was in Udhampur. This is both in Jammu. And then we came for 2 years to Kulgam, 1 year to Baramulla, then 2 years to Leh, Ladakh, and then several years in Anantnag. So I did my high schooling from Anantnag, and I did my PUC, which used to be called Pre-University College, 1 year college.
Right.
And after that, I joined the engineering college in Srinagar, and subsequently to IIT Delhi. So my father was orphaned very young. He lost his mother when he was only 6 months old. Then he lost his father. His father was in the police department, and on some operation up in the hills, he was killed. So my father was then raised by his uncle, and then for some time he spent his childhood raised by his older brother, who was a college lecturer in Kapurthala. So I think a lot of the values I got was from my father, because he was into knowledge and learning, and he had been before he got married, he really wanted to be a yogi, and he had a preceptor. But then finally, his preceptor told him, no, go ahead and get married and raise a family and so on. So we used to hear all these very interesting stories about what Kashmir's own past was, and also the importance of being modern, contemporary, consider everybody the same, which is the larger Kashmiri Pandit value, or we can call
Right.
it the larger Indian value.
Right.
And so that was the atmosphere that I grew up in.
Mhm.
And as a child, I was a voracious reader.
Mhm.
In my teens, I literally read up all the great Western classics that you can think of, ranging from Russian to French to German to English or American literature. And I really wanted to be a writer,
Right.
but my mother, who's a Karihalu from Srinagar, she said, "No way! What are you going to? How are you going to support yourself as a writer?" So she
Okay.
packed me off to engineering college, and but I still maintained my uh, desire, if you will,
Mhm.
to be in the literary world,
Right.
which is why I've spent a lot of time writing poetry, many books on that,
Right.
and then other stuff, history and this and that. So that's been my, let's call it two lives, dual lives.
Two lives.
And yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Subhashji, my second question is, because this is a community podcast, so obviously I have to, keep that thing in the mind. So my next question to you is, when a community is forced to live in exile, how important the meaning of identity becomes. So, and I also want to learn from you, and I think audience is definitely curious to know what is the meaning of the word identity purely from a Kashmiri Hindu or Pandit perspective. Once we are in exile.
It is very challenging if you are exiled, and because one's identity is also tied up to the smells and sounds of the place. And Kashmir was this magical place, the most astonishing history that you can imagine. It
Right.
was probably um, a place where some of the greatest literature and discoveries were made from until about 1300.
Right.
That period, if you look at literature, you look at art, you look at philosophy, and the crafts and sculpture, etc. Because we do know that after 1300s, a lot of the Kashmiri families went down and settled down in Kangra or in the hills of Jammu, and the great art that we have, like, for example, Basoli art or Kangra art, was really done by Kashmiri families. So the connection with land is extremely important, and this is absolutely tragic because, in many ways, it's one of the most horrific events, if you will, in recent times, where a community has been literally expelled, ethnically cleansed from its land to which it's been connected for thousands of years. Another community which has suffered a lot, perhaps, horrific um, situation with their families, is of course the Yazidis
Right.
in Iraq. But at least they've come back after all the horrific stuff that was done to them by ISIS. They've at
Nice.
least come back to Sinjar, while that's not happened with Kashmir. But one can hope, given the history where um, 700 years ago, once again, there was ethnic cleansing. Kashmiri Pandits were sort of cleansed out, and it's
Right.
believed that only 11 families were left.
Yep.
And then they came back. I am a optimist.
Right.
I hope and I believe that Kashmiri Pandits will go back. And why? Because Kashmiri Pandits represent this identity is an identity of universality, of wisdom. It's not narrow. In fact, if you ask me, why is it that Kashmiri Pandits have been such a great administrators? If you look at the 19th century, all across India, some of the divans and so on were from Kashmir, or during the horrific Afghan rule, and Afghans ruled late 18th century. There was also an instance when this Afghan governor, when he has done with his term, he took one of the Kashmiri Pandits back to Kabul, and he was made the prime minister of the Afghan Empire. And so why was this all? Because
Right.
of the values that we have, and this value is, be fair, judge, trust, do good to everybody that you can, be honest.
Right.
So I think now, certainly, these are values that we are going to inculcate in our children, no matter where we are, whether we are in America, Australia, or anywhere else.
Right.
But still, the smells and the sounds and the music, that was wonderful to the soul. And I
Just
think we do need to get connected and be optimistic that this will
right.
happen.
Wonderful. And sir, next question is like, as all of us know that Kashmir is known as the cradle, crown, or the fountainhead of the Indian civilization. And we have been hearing these false narratives of late that the Kashmir never had any sort of cultural or civilization connect with the rest of the India. So could you please throw some more light on this, particularly for the better comprehension of the younger generation, to understand it in the right perspective?
Kashmir was integrally connected. It was a part of the great Indian culture and civilization right from the earliest times. And we see that if you read Kalhan's Raj Tarangani, where all these connections are drawn. And
Right.
I've written an essay called The Wonder That Was Kashmir, where I also go back into these connections, which is available on the internet. Now, some of the greatest Sanskrit literature, what is the vehicle of Indian culture and civilization? What is, just like right now across India, we use English, even though our own personal languages may be different.
Right.
In the classical period of India, everybody used Sanskrit, including in the southernmost regions of India. And when Indian culture went across the seas to Southeast Asia, again they took Sanskrit with them. So Kashmir was one of the greatest centers of Sanskrit learning right from the very beginning. And some of the great names that come to mind is, first of all, Panani. He was not a Kashmiri, but he was just to the west of Kashmir. He was born near the intersection of Kabul River with another small river. But he was a part of what is called Gandhar, and Gandhar
Okay.
included Peshawar and northwestern part, which is where Takshashila University or Taxila University was. And it was also, the Kashmiri kings also from time to time ruled western regions.
Right.
So Panani, according to Western scholars, is probably the greatest genius who ever lived, because he was able to represent all of Sanskrit language in just 4,000 algebraic rules in a kind of a computer program, and he lived 500 BCE. Now,
Right.
the person who really made Panani so famous all over the world was a Kashmiri named Patanjali, who wrote the big commentary on Panani's Ashtadhyayi, and that commentary is called Mahabhashya. And great book, and it tells you a lot about the customs and culture and how people worshipped and the divinities and so on. And
Right.
Patanjali, as you also know, wrote
The yoga,
the Yoga
the yoga,
Sutras.
the sutras.
And Yoga Sutra is one of the two foundational texts of yoga. If you look at Hinduism in general,
General.
if Hinduism is the Vedas, Vedas have six darshans. Five of them are analytical,
Right.
like Mimamsa, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Vedanta. But one is synthetic, which is about how should one live one's life, and that's yoga. So yoga is lived Hinduism. And as we
Right.
know, right now, yoga is conquering all corners of the world. Everybody
World.
wants to do yoga.
Absolutely.
Even women in Iran or in Saudi Arabia are doing yoga. And yoga is lived Hinduism. And the other great book of yoga, of course, is the Bhagavad Gita, which
The Bhagavad.
speaks about different kinds of yoga. So Patanjali was a Kashmiri. We know that. Patanjali also did one of the revisions of the Charak Samhita, which is Ayurveda, or Dridbal. That was Dridbal. Okay, that is also from Kashmir. So not only this, you have foundational texts of art like Vishnu Dharmottar Puran. You have philosophy, the whole Shaivism thing. You know, you go back to the Shiva Sutras, and you have great philosophers such as Anandavardhan, or later on Abhinav Gupta, and so on, Utpal Deva, and so on. So every field, poetry, music, Sharang Dev, you know, who wrote Sangeet Ratnakar, foundation, one of the foundational texts of music. And some people have suggested that even Bharat Muni, who wrote Natya Shastra. Natya Shastra is also being called the fifth Veda. And Natya Shastra is the foundational text in Indian civilization for arts, for music, for theater, and so on. And one of the things that it talks about, well, it has 36 chapters. That is one reason why people think he might have been a Kashmiri, because as we know, the Kashmir Shaivism has 36 tattvas, while in the Sankhya system there are 25. And so 36 is a number that comes up again and again in Kashmir. And Natya Shastra also talks about Bhandapatra, which is Bhandapathar of Kashmir. Exactly. Yeah, so these are suggestions. There is no definitive proof that Bharat Muni was a Kashmiri, but there are a lot of suggestions that he might have been a Kashmiri. So to come back to your question, literally every field of the arts, humanities, history, sciences, you find that Kashmir has made fundamental contributions. And in fact, when the great Iranian writer Al-Biruni, he came with Mahmud of Ghazni, I believe, and he accompanied him, and he wrote his famous book Al-Hind, History of India. And there he said he was not able to come to Kashmir. He said that we have not been able to come to the two great centers of learning, which is Kashmir and Banaras. So these were the two great centers. And then, of course, you had Sharda Peeth. You know, all the great innovators in Indian thought, like Shankaracharya or Ramanujacharya, when they wanted to get international or national acceptance in India, they first came to Sharda Peeth. And there they presented what they had, or they had discussions with the scholars in Sharda Peeth. And that's how they got the imprint of, okay, here is somebody who really knows his stuff. So truly one of the centers of Indian civilization. And not only that, Kashmir was also the springboard to Central Asia. Just beyond the Himalayas was the city of Khotan, which is in Xinjiang, which is now called Khotan. And so there also Kashmirian languages, you know, a Gandhari language was partly used, which is probably an ancient version of Kashmiri. And from there, Kashmiri scholars, a whole string of them, including the great Kumaraji, they impacted Asian civilization, Chinese, Japanese, and all that. And that is in one direction, and the other direction towards Central Asia, Bukhara, Samarkand, and all the way to Europe. So Kashmir has been truly one of the most remarkable places in the entire world in human history.
Absolutely. And sir, I would also want to draw your kind attention to the origin and, you know, the development of the Kashmiri language. I mean, we have heard that, you know, it has roots in the Rigvedic language, you know, and there was one late Dr. Trilokinath Ganju, a great scholar from Kashmir, who had, you know, this profound research on this subject. And we would definitely like to, you know, get enlightened from you on this thing also.
Well, during the Vedic period, the geography that we have does include Vitasta as one of the rivers. You know, these are the Sapta Sindhu, the whole region the heartland of the Vedas was a region which ranged from the Kabul River all the way to the Ganga River. So the
Right.
whole of northwest India, and it included Vitasta, and it is mentioned. So the Vedic rishis um, apparently also lived in Kashmir or in the mountains south of Kashmir as well,
Right.
including places like maybe Kishtawar or Bhadrava and all that stuff. And now, Kashmiri language, as has been traced recently, is say goes back to about 7, 8, 900 years, right? We have Laladyad, for example,
Love that. Right.
Laleshwari, and so on, where the earliest Vak in Kashmiri we have.
Right.
But clearly, and when you go back, say 1,000 years from now, and you look at the accounts that we have of Abhinav Gupta speaking to his disciples, who
Disciples.
also included men as well as women, because
Women.
Kashmiri society was very free society. Women and
Liberal.
men,
Right.
yeah, liberal. They rubbed shoulders on an equal basis, and you have references to that in Nilmat Quran as well. And so, um, although people spoke in Sanskrit, there one could imagine that there was also languages, Prakrits. All over India, Sanskrit was the high language, and Prakrits were used, and Kashmiri is one of the Prakrits.
Okay.
And how far back it goes, I think research needs to be done to see whether the Gandhari, which is used in Gandhar, because
Right.
the Gandhar is just west of Kashmir, across Sharda Peeth.
Sure.
And since we know that Gandhari was also used in Xinjiang, etc., and we have a lot of texts that have come from Central Asia. This is one of the huge modern projects. What happened was this whole of trans-Himalayan region of Central Asia, where there was a lot of Kashmirian influence and Sanskrit influence, because these were books. For 1,000 years, these Sanskrit texts were translated into Chinese, because
Right.
Buddhism was a big thing. And so these texts would go from here, and other literary texts also, because there we have also art, and we have representations of Shiva.
Sure.
Shiva, in fact, was extremely important all over Asia, including China, Central Asia. Shiva was included in also in the trinity of the Zoroastrians in Bukhara and Samarkand,
Okay.
because at that time the Zoroastrianism was the religion to the west of Khotan. And Maheshwar or Shiva was also incorporated into Buddhism itself. So, in fact, even now, Buddhists worship Nilakant. There's a very famous stotra, which is in Buddhism called Dharani, which is called Nilakanta Dharani, in which the most praised Bodhisattvas are these enlightened beings who lived before Buddha, where
Right.
Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara worships Nilakant. Nilakant, of course, is another name for Shiva.
Shiva.
So
Right.
even now, Buddhists in China worship Shiva. Shiva was this, Kashmir, although Kashmiris both worship Krishna and Shiva,
Shiva,
because Hinduism is, if I may very quickly tell you,
Sure.
the Vedas speak of wisdom as being three-pronged, Trayi Vidya, triple
Right.
knowledge.
Trouble.
And these three are Sat, Chit, and Ananda. Sat is Vishnu, Chit is Shiva, and Ananda is the goddess. So Kashmiris worship all the three, but at some point, the focus was into introspection and Shiva, because Shiva represents consciousness. Shiva is the principle of consciousness. So it's the path of knowledge. The whole of Vedas and the focus of Kashmiri civilization was of knowledge, which is universal knowledge, which is the reason right now all over the world people are getting into Kashmir Shaivism. And of course, yoga for asanas, and asanas are the doorway to a deeper understanding of oneself. As we know, in Patanjali's Ashtanga yoga, you do yam, niyam, which is initial preparation, moral and ethical preparation.
Right.
Then the asanas, then pranayama.
Right.
Pranayama is, of course, stretching the breath,
Breath.
which is to go within oneself to find out who one is physically and in terms of one's various processes within. So truly an amazing universal thing. And my hope is that people will once again, once they feel that freedom, which they are doing, let's say in Europe and America, even the Kashmiris in Kashmir will come back to it
Right.
because this embraces everybody. And if
Absolutely.
अगर वो इससे खफा हो गए हैं और
जी,
हट गए हैं, दोबारा भी शायद जुड़ सकते हैं.
जुड़ सकते हैं.
हाँ, ये मेरा विश्वास है.
And Subhashi, do you think it is not wrong to say that the yoga is the best gift of Sanatan Dharma to the entire humanity or to the world? And right,
Absolutely, yoga is Sanatan Dharma in life. See, Sanatan Dharma has two sides. Sanatan Dharma is one is thinking and philosophy and so on.
right,
But how do you live is yoga. So yoga is Hinduism. Yoga is Sanatan Dharma. And the greatest book of yoga, of course, apart from Patanjali's Yoga Sutra,
Yoga Sutra.
is Bhagavad Gita. And in
Right.
Bhagavad Gita, what does Krishna say? He says, you can, based on your temperament, you can do yoga in different ways. You can do jnana yoga if you're into intellectual stuff. You can do
Right.
karma yoga if you want to be a good human being. Karma
Yes.
yoga is good life of good actions. Or you can do bhakti yoga, which is devotion. Right?
Devotion.
So yoga is truly the greatest gift, and it is something that the entire world right now, even the smallest towns, when you travel a lot like I do, Africa or Europe or even South America, small towns, you'll see yoga studios everywhere.
Everywhere. Absolutely. Absolutely. And Subhashi, I would also like to, know the poetic aspect of your life. When did you? I'm very curious, by the way. When did you write the very first poem in your life, and at what age, and what was it all about? And I mean, you certainly have authored The Secrets of Ishwar. How does poetry change? I mean, this is a question. How does poetry change before and after a person is in exile?
Well, I remember when I was in Leh, I must have been 10 or 11,
Mhm.
writing, one of those dohas in Hindi.
Okay.
And then formally, I think I was 15 or 14 or 15 when I started writing a lot of poetry in English and in Hindi.
Right.
And when I was in college, I put together a small collection. I showed it to teachers and this and that. And then on many occasions, I was invited by Radio Kashmir in Srinagar to read my poems.
Right.
And so now, and then of course, I've written many, many books of poetry. But I think my poetry really, after the 90s, is a poetry of exile. In fact, one of my poems in the book Secrets of Ishwar,
Right.
it says, if I remember the lines correctly, it says, the best paradise is the paradise that you're exiled from. Those are the ending lines. And so that's the paradise we remember. In a certain sense, this is something about life itself. In many ways, no matter where we are and where we belong and who we are,
Right.
we enter this life and there are all these rejections, if you will. We hope that things would all be perfect, and then they don't turn out to be perfect. So in many ways, in our individual personal lives also, not just as a Kashmiri, but for any human being, there are these exiles. These are not necessarily physical exiles. There is also emotional exiles. The idea of exile is something very central to the human condition. Absolutely. And so for me, while initially the books that I wrote in the 70s, 1970s that is, were probably more to do with deeper experience about what life is or love and relationships. But after the 90s, it's been more about
Exile
exile
process.
which has been informed by the tragic experience of our community.
Community. Absolutely. And I mean, just continuing on that, what is your opinion on the literature in exile that has been produced by other Kashmiri Hindu poets and authors as well? After the exodus of 1990, what's your how do you see it in the larger framework of the global literature we have as on date?
I have read some wonderful poetry uh, written by Kashmiri Pandits after the 90s, some wonderful poetry. And there have been some novels that have also been written. But I think what needs to be done is to compile it in a fashion so that it's much more accessible. And
Right.
fortunately, now we on the internet have resources which make it easy for material to be made accessible by everybody. So I think while wonderful work has been done, great writing has been made, but it's not being made accessible, or what needs to be done is for it to be translated first of all into
Right.
different languages, and also to be made accessible, in terms of
Like a central
perhaps
repository kind of thing.
recordings, and put on the internet. You have
Right.
platforms such as academia, where I have a lot of
Academia.
my stuff, and it's free for anybody
Right.
to download and free for you to upload also. So it's free both ways. So I think one needs to use all these resources to have even a greater impact than the
Impact.
one that's been made until now.
I think that's a wonderful suggestion, and yes, and a very practical one. Subhashi, in one of your earlier conversations, I heard it was on the topic of again the contribution of Kashmir to the world. You had mentioned that Yog Vashisht, as a magnum opus from Kashmir, and if I'm not wrong, you said that the author of Yog Vashisht was also from Kashmir, or probably I heard it incorrectly. So I was like little curious to put this question just to
Scholars believe that Yoga Vasisht was written in Kashmir. It is a
Mhm.
Kashmirian text. And in my judgment, having read it very carefully many times, and being very familiar with world literature, as I mentioned, right from my
Right. Yeah.
teenage years, I can say that this is probably one of the greatest books ever written. You leave it, let aside Ramayana, Mahabharata, and so on. They're great epics on a grand scale
Great.
that have
Yeah.
no
Substitute.
equal.
Right.
But leaving that, now this is the third largest, biggest book in Sanskrit, also next to
Right.
Mahabharata and Ramayana.
Right.
And in my view, in terms of storytelling, in terms of its layers,
Right.
um, um, and its story within story genre, which of course we find elsewhere in Kashmir. Also, in fact, some people say that even Panchatantra, Vishnu Sharma was a
The Vishnu
Kashmiri, and
Sharmas.
that's also one of the great, great books. But that's of course the animal talking genre that's been translated
Correct.
any number of times into all kinds of languages. But Yoga Vasisht is not that well known. But I
Right.
think as a novel, if some people look at it as a scripture,
Scripture.
as a book of spirituality, book of knowledge. But if you didn't want to do that, if you wanted to look at it as a novel, I think it's the greatest novel that's ever been written.
Right. And what do you think about the great Kalidasa? Do you think, because I have heard like in some conversations that he also had traces from Kashmiri. He used to hail. Is it true?
I doubt it. I think
Okay.
he was really from near Ujjain,
Right.
but some people have made the case because in Meghadutam, Meghadoot, he speaks of this person who's,
Yeah.
going,
The
talking of clouds and coming
messenger.
to
Right.
mountains and so on, Himalaya and so on. But I personally doubt it. I think he was really uh,
From
in
Ujjain.
uh, in central India,
Hmm.
and the focus at that time, there was amazing stuff being done in central India at that time. People like Bhartrihari and so many philosophers and writers and so on. Although people are also moving back and forth. Abhinav Gupta's own family was from Kanya Kubja,
Right.
his great grandfather or something, and Abhinav Gupta, as we know, is also one of the great philosophers of the world.
And so like his origins were not from Kashmir, the Acharya
No,
one.
no, his own biography, he mentions that I think it was Lalita Ditya, in one of his campaigns when he went to central India or North India, he conquered some regions. I
Right,
think his family, I think his ancestor was Atri Gupta. He
right.
was brought with Lalita Ditya, and then they settled in
In
Kashmir.
Kashmir, right. Absolutely. Subhashji, I mean, let's talk about the culture, because as a community, unfortunately, every passing day, as a community, we are, nearing the extinction. We have that sense of probably urgency, if I may call it, like, and we have been off late hearing a lot of scholars from our community and seniors who have been saying that, we have to do something to, survive and, revive our culture, and, the reversal of the cultural genocide. And how important do you think, speaking in the native language is important, like, and I also want to know your thoughts on, the what solutions can we have on table, when we talk of the reversal of our cultural genocide, and probably the role of Kashmiri Pandit diaspora, who is, spread across the globe outside India.
Absolutely. I think when we go back and look at Kashmiri families who left Kashmir, say 400 years ago, there are lots of them in, say, UP,
Correct.
including, as we know, the Nehrus, but also in South India, a lot of the people in Konkan who are Saraswats. Saraswats were the people who lived to the north of Saraswati River. And Saraswati River, as we know, north of that is Punjab and Kashmir. So the Saraswats in South India believe they came down from Kashmir, and as you know, Sringeri Mutt, they worship Sharada
Right.
Devi, right?
Devi.
Who is the Adhishratri Devi of Kashmir.
Right.
So Kashmiris have been exiled or have had to, because of circumstances, have had to leave the valley, and they've still remembered their origin and they love it. In fact, they, uh, they, the Shankaracharya, the current Adhish of Shankaracharya Mutt from
But
Sringeri, came
right.
to Teachwal just last week
Mm.
to inaugurate this new Sharda temple, right, which has
at,
been
at T12.
renovated or built.
Right. Right.
So there are two sides, several sides to it. One is some people will lose the language, as was lost by people who went to South India or went to UP or elsewhere, but they'll still be connected uh, to that memory, which will keep
Memories.
on inspiring them. Now, fortunately, now we have technology. Earlier on, it was much harder to retain language. Now we have technology. We can try to uh, remain connected to Kashmiri language to the extent we can. But even there, a lot of Kashmiris are marrying non-Kashmiris,
Right.
and it becomes harder for the
Right.
children to remain
Connect to that.
connected
Right.
to language. So
Exactly.
that will continue.
Right.
So my personal thing is this. I think in addition to trying very hard to remain connected to Kashmiri language to the extent we can, we must also go back to the other Kashmiri language from which we have been sort of separated, which is Sanskrit itself.
Right.
Sanskrit is, Kashmiris made the most incredible contributions to Sanskrit. In fact, I came across somebody saying this, I don't know if it's true, that more than 50% of all the great texts in Sanskrit, and Sanskrit has some of the greatest literature in terms of volume of
Right.
any classical language, were written in by Kashmiris or in this greater Kashmir region.
Right.
So I think this is something that we need to do, because after 1947, somehow the elders of the Kashmiri community said that we have to be modern, let's get connected to English, and
Right.
let's get away from Sanskrit. Okay, Kashmiri and maybe English. But my advice would be
Mm.
that Kashmiri good, English good, but let's get connected to Sanskrit.
Sanskrit.
Sanskrit is
Source.
that
Yeah.
kalpa vriksha, which means that wishing tree which
Yes.
grants all wishes.
Right.
It is the source of the most incredible inspiration. And this is how we'll get connected. If we could read Yoga Vasisht in Kashmiri and
Yeah.
certainly Yoga Sutras and the other stuff, I think that'd be truly wonderful. I think that's what we should do. The community should decide that we will encourage our children also to learn Kashmiri. Now, I can tell you an example. Right now, Indians are at the pinnacle of almost all the companies, the biggest companies in the
Big.
world, right?
Absolutely.
And most of these Indians are from South India who
Right.
are still connected to Sanskrit.
Sanskrit.
South Indians, once a week, what they do is they get together and they chant the 1,000 names of Vishnu
Vishnu
Sahasranam.
Sahasranam. Right.
And when you're chanting, it just that process of chanting teaches you Sandhi and so on.
So
That makes getting into Sanskrit so much more easier.
easier. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
And
my
that,
advice would be, please do learn Sanskrit. Do whatever you can. There are resources on the internet, and there is Sanskrit Bharati. There is an organization all across the world where they have weekend camps
camps.
where they teach you how to do conversational Sanskrit. And
Absolutely.
please
Absolutely.
do that if you can.
And that's a great message, and I think that was so rightly said by you. When you said, the analogy of a kalpavriksha, of compared it with the Sanskrit. Um, Subhashi, I would also, want to know from you, let's come back. I'm sorry for drawing your attention too much to the Kashmiri Pandits, because, most of the audience here is the Kashmiri Pandits. So I want to also know from you, like, Kashmiri Pandits have been, categorized as migrants since 1990, and not as probably genocide victims or genocide survivors, if I may say so. And as far as the case of Kashmiri Hindu or Kashmiri Pandit genocide is concerned, there have been definitely a lot of efforts to seek justice for the community. But do you think, in your honest opinion, can justice be ever served, or to put this question in this way, in absence of a law, or more specifically, a genocide law in India? Do you think that is something, as a community, we should probably request the government or reach out, to have a genocide law in India, so that, we are, served as well the justice?
Well, it's really heartrending to see all those empty buildings in Habba Kadal or in the villages all across Kashmir, which is
Right.
where the vibrant Kashmiri community lived,
Right.
that they have been forced to abandon. But really, if you think of the Kashmiri Pandit situation from the perspective of more recent world history,
Right.
we become victims to a war that's been going on maybe within Islam, and uh, which is, how does Islam deal with non-Muslims? If you look at
Mhm.
this situation, you'll
Right.
find wherever Muslims and non-Muslims live, there are wars going on. Look at Asia,
Asia.
look at even Thailand, or there's conflict. There's
Right.
conflict everywhere.
Right.
And certainly in Europe, where a lot of refugees have come, there have been so many instances of terrorism and so on, bombings
So,
and so on.
right.
So the problem is, I'll speak very honestly. You look at UK.
Right.
UK also has that many bombings, right?
Right.
And recently there were riots in Leicester. You look at
Right.
UK. People from India and Pakistan have gone there,
Right.
and there are a bit more Pakistanis than Indians, but maybe about the same proportion. Now, if you look at the jail population,
Right.
the Muslims in UK form 18%, because we have definitive statistics on it. 18% of the jail population, even though their own population is only 4% or 3 or 4%, but they're
Right.
18% in the jails.
Right.
Hindus are literally 0%.
Mhm.
They're less than 1%. They're literally 0%.
Zero
So
percent.
what's really going on? One's got to confront it. The problem is Muslims, with their view of the world, where they classify people into believers and non-believers,
non-believers.
and that they must conquer non-believers. So
Right.
Kashmiri Pandits became a victim to this ideology.
To this
And this
ideology.
is what's going on elsewhere as well. But
Right.
this ultimately hurts the Muslims because they're not able to compete. If you raise your children with this feeling, with the sense that, look, everybody else is inferior
Right.
or they are non-believers, so you
Right.
got to conquer them, you will not be able to negotiate in a sensible way in
Right.
this world where
Right.
you have to use science and everything else. So it's really hurting the Muslims having adopted this path. So
Absolutely.
what really needs to happen is for Kashmiri Muslims to recognize that they got to abandon this and accept that all humans are equal, as
Equal.
Kashmiri Hindus do. You know, what
Right.
is Kashmir Shaivite philosophy? It
Correct.
says that every human being has Shiva within them. Shivoham. I am Shiva. And Shiva means consciousness, which is divine, right?
Absolutely.
So I think part of the resolution of this problem is a greater effort that we, as inheritors to this incredible wisdom, have
Right.
to reach out also to the Muslims, because they are good Muslims also, and strengthen them
Strengthen
and
them.
say that, look, this is there's got to be a change of heart.
Heart.
Because right now what's happening is, and it's a difficult problem politically for any administration.
Mhm.
You go back to Kashmir, and many Kashmiri Pandits have tried to go back,
Right.
and then they can be picked off one by one, or somebody random killing.
Right.
But
Target.
but if you look at what's going on in Israel, for example, um, many dozens, I think 36 Israelis have been murdered by Palestinians just in the last 2-3 months, and these are civilians; these are random people.
Random.
So war is a part of life. Danger is a part of life, and so I think what the government of India needs to do is when they send people back to Kashmir, they should also be given at least ways to protect themselves. And I can tell you a story from my father's life, and he writes about it in his autobiography. He
Right.
says when he was young, he was a young veterinary doctor, and he was posted to this place in Jammu, where there were a lot of fundamentalist Muslims who
Right.
were who just didn't want him there.
There.
So there were threats issued to him that they were going to kill him. So now he was just by himself as a young man. So what he did was he bought a gun, and then he went to during a day, he went to the roof of the house. As you know,
Yeah.
in
That.
Jammu you have flat roofs,
The flat
and he
roofs.
fired this gun a few times in the air, just
Okay.
to let people know that he had a gun. And
Veterans.
just the thought that he had
Right.
a gun ensured that nobody, because sometimes people who do violence,
Yeah.
they are really cowards at heart.
Exactly.
If they know that you're going to fight back, they'll probably not attack you.
Attack you.
It doesn't
Absolutely.
guarantee that they won't attack you.
Absolutely.
But I think these practical things need to be considered, that people need to be armed. If you send them back, you train them for a week, send them back with guns so that they can protect themselves, only to protect themselves. if
Themselves.
one if you send that message, the bad people that there are, because not everybody is bad, the
Yeah.
bad people would know that there is a cost to doing violence.
To doing
And
violence.
you also have to ensure that there were also school teachers who were killed in a women's school, high school or higher secondary school in Srinagar just last year. So you
Right.
also have to ensure that there is enough protection, and that is one of the tragedies of modern times. You look at all the gun violence in America, how
America.
many people are being killed every day.
Absolutely.
So modernity also requires greater investment on protection, and I would hope that the J&K government will ensure that all the Kashmiri Pandits who go back on government service with their families are protected properly.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely. And Subhashi, my last question on the show. I'm sorry, I'm just running short of time also, but this is a very important question because I'm on a Panun Kashmir platform. So this question has been put to me from the organizers. They want to know from you what were your memories of the Margdarshan, historic Margdarshan resolution of 99, the significance of the movement of Panun Kashmir. And I'm not sure if you are aware that, in the year 2020, Panun Kashmir, sent a draft bill to the different government offices in India, and it was titled the Panun Kashmir Genocide and Atrocities Bill 2020, just to suggest government of India to bring in a strong genocide law in the country. So, do you think government of India should consider this, and how important is it in your perspective?
I was at that Margdarshan meeting in Jammu many, many years ago.
Right,
Now, I don't know personally what a genocide law will do.
right.
What I don't know if you could quickly tell me, would it
So it's
compensate people?
it is basically it all actually comes down to, a state, a respective state, actually recognizing a certain group of people as official victims of genocide, something that is official status of being a genocide survivor or a genocide victim, as opposed to, just, verbally saying somebody is a genocide victim. So that makes you in, actually brings you in a protective group of people, and then there are certain things that
But
apply.
yeah, no, no, I get that. But we that needs to be done anyway.
Right,
Every citizen must be protected. The law should be equal, and certainly as a community that has suffered not only at an individual level in horrific ways, but also as a whole community. Inter
right,
our sacred places and everything else. So we do need that. In the least, what the government needs to do, as I pointed out before, is provide greater security. And you have to invest. The government has to invest and make sure that more and more people can come back, and perhaps ensure that if they come back and they work for various departments, that
right.
there is a secure area. And this is something that is being done even in the United States. Do you know that the fear of violence is so much that there are gated communities? People live in gated communities. There are
Get it.
gates. Not everybody can
Absolutely.
come in. So sadly, this is something that will happen. And look at Pakistan itself, because Pakistan, as we know, has sponsored a lot of the bad stuff in Kashmir. Pakistan is a basket case. There is violence all across.
Right,
They are literally a failed state. So part of the problem, the resolution would also be as the Pakistani drama plays out, because Pakistan, in my judgment,
right.
uh, being based on the concept of othering
The
India or
India.
hating India, uh,
Absolutely.
cannot survive in this modern world, cannot
Right.
compete technologically or otherwise. So, as Pakistan collapses, I think the sponsors of hate that have done this horrific thing to our wonderful community of such beautiful people. From
People.
as I was growing up, I can tell you that I have nothing but the greatest respect for individuals, Kashmiri Pandits as individuals, and as well wishers of everybody, not just doing it for themselves,
So
but doing
absolutely.
it not only for their community, but for everybody.
Everybody.
So,
Absolutely.
for such a wonderful community to suffer whatever they have, I would I would say that maybe the Pakistanis who've done this, we are going to be suffering the consequences of that hate. Nelson Mandela famously said, "Hate is a poison that you drink to kill your to kill your enemy." So the Pakistanis
Right.
have drunk this poison of hate, and
Poison.
ultimately, although they harmed our community, they harmed Kashmir, or they have tried to harm India, they will end up hurting themselves in horrific ways.
Absolutely right. And one last question before we say goodbye to each other. How does this the hatred, that's ideological hatred towards, probably the intolerance towards somebody who is not a believer in what I believe, how do you see this in because obviously this can't be seen as a spiritual thing, but from a humanistic point of view, what should be the approach of the more liberal, modern, the very inclusive Muslims towards this already.
Christianity did this too.
Right.
The genocide that Christianity perpetuated, for example, in the Americas or elsewhere, horrific. But at some time, about 300-400 years ago, wise people amongst Christians stood up and said, "We are not going to look at Christianity in this way, and we are not going to say every word in the Bible is something that we believe in. We're going to
Right.
pick and choose. We pick and choose what's humanistic." So there are good Christians, and it's not an issue. Of course, there are extreme Christians also, who are still doing bad stuff.
Right.
So what we need to do is to strengthen forward-looking humanistic Muslims,
Right.
and sadly, the media in Delhi and elsewhere often brings in as representatives of Islam some of the most obnoxious people.
Absolutely.
And I think they have to change. They have to censor. Just as if you look at the media in the United States, they don't get everybody. They don't give everybody a platform. In India, we are giving platform to the worst people, and this is something that's happened in even the politics in Kashmir. The
Right.
government of India for the past 60, 70 years has supported in Kashmir Muslim leadership, which is really not being the best in the best interest of the Muslims themselves. They've taken advantage of their position
Right.
to enrich themselves and their families. So I think the time has come for to connect with the good people on the ground,
Right.
strengthen them, people who believe in humanism, and that I think will solve the problem. And hopefully, Kashmiri Pandits will be able to go back, and this great land, which is created, which has been the source of so much of wisdom for all of humanity, will once
Right.
again flourish.
Thank you so much for those kind words and that optimism, sir. It's always pleasure to host you, and I will definitely want you to, invite you someday soon. Thank you so much. It was an honor to have you on the show, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Himalay.
Thank you, sir. So, guys, I will see you on the next episode of the Homeland podcast. तो time दिए इजाजत. Orzu, Jai Panun Kashmir.